Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether we're even asking the right questions to begin with. At a corner table by the fire are two people. One of them is going on and on about this great blog that he read back in 2008. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to better understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So it's kind of a cliche for artists and storytellers, especially in our more modern times, that we are supposed to question everything. You know, challenge the privileged assumptions of society, put the system on trial, deconstruct the panopticon of oppression, you know, things to that effect. But what does that mean for us as Christian artists? Or for that matter, as just Christian people? Well, if you're the sort of person who's listening to this podcast, then there's a good chance that you've gone through a period of doubting and questioning your faith. Maybe you're currently in that period. What are the ways to journey through those questions well? And what are some common pitfalls to avoid? Okay, so I'll put my own cards on the table for a moment. I went through my own period of doubt when I was in college. And during that time, a really good anchoring presence for me was this blog out of Southern California. It was run by some recent Biola grads who were a few years ahead of me. And kind of like digital older brothers, they gave me a good example of living a Christian life that was intellectually rigorous, curious, and still faithful. That blog, of course, is Mere Orthodoxy, and one of its founders, Matthew Lee Anderson, joins us here today. Now, after founding Mere Orthodoxy, Matthew Lee Anderson went on to get his DPhil in Christian ethics from Oxford University, and he is currently an associate professor of ethics and theology at Baylor University's Honors College. He also happens to have a book that is just recently out called Called into Questions, which looks at this topic of questioning and doubting faithfully. So, Matthew Lee Anderson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm taken aback by that introduction. I was not prepared.
This goes all the way back to the mid 2000s. This is decades in the making now.
You were early. That is centuries ago in internet time.
This is basically right after the Gutenberg press was invented, that sort of thing for the internet. So
I think so. Really impressed.
You. So point of order for me. So I always see your name written on posts or articles as Matthew Lee Anderson. But when we're here at the digital pub table, what are we going for? Are we going for Dr. Anderson, Matthew, Matt? I mean, I'm flexible as a fellow Matthew.
Whatever rolls off the tongue easiest is what I tell people. I've been called worse, and so Matt, Matthew, whichever you prefer is fine.
That totally makes sense. Then just so you know, I'm gonna try to do Matthew, but you know, when you talk to someone you've read his writing of, you just go, the whole thing just flows. Matthew Lee Anderson. So that may start happening. But yeah, you have a book that is just coming out, and again, I think for listeners to a podcast like this, it's going to be very, very relevant. So let's start with the basics. What's your book about?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in questioning and questions and how they work. A lot of that has to do with my intellectual formation. I mean, you mentioned starting a website out of Southern California. That website was shaped heavily by my experience at Biola University's Torrey Honors College. It was a number of friends of mine and I who went through the program. And we decided that we wanted to carry on our project of thinking together out loud with each other, because that's what we did as undergrads. We sat around for 3 hours at a time, 3 times a week, so 9 hours a week, with a text, and we asked questions about that text, and we asked questions of one another. And we tried to come to an understanding of the text, an understanding of how the text shaped our perceptions of the world, and an understanding in light of both those things about the truth. What is actually real and true and good and beautiful. And so from that time, I just have really loved thinking about questioning, because if you spend a lot of time in a discussion environment, you eventually start making assessments about, what are we doing here? How are we doing this well? How are we doing this badly? What can I do as a discussion participant to make sure that my questions are actually moving the discussion forward in a constructive and healthy way? Like, what's happening in this classroom? And, I shortly after college, I started teaching in a discussion classroom. And then it was really a sort of practical applied practice for me. I was asking my students questions and trying to get my students to a point where they loved questioning as much as I did. And this book is really the fruit of all that. It's my attempt to articulate the place that questions have within the Christian life. Questioning, I think, is the intellectual form of our love for God, our love for the world, and our love for each other. It's the way in which our love takes shape. And I think that's, it's been helpful for me to think about questioning in that sort of terms.
Yeah. And again, let's go back to the ancient internet days. So like early 2000s.
Yeah.
And this for me is when I, first encountered these things too, just because this is when I was in college. And it seemed at the time that there was this new generation of sort of doubting evangelicals rising up. And it was my impression at the time, like, whoa, this is brand new. But also now with a little bit more perspective, it's like, is this brand new, or is this just a fruit of being a young person? So now you have the benefit of having lived that, and now you're a professor for a new generation of young people. So do you think what was going on then was new, or is this just a constant stream of, young Christians coming into their own?
Yeah, I don't think that what was happening with the doubting Christians phenomenon was new. If you look back to, say, Victorian spirituality, there's the Victorian evangelicals made much of faith. But anytime you put a lot of weight on believing, you're going to have a complementary discussion about what you do with doubts. And a decade ago, lots of evangelicals who were coming of age had been shaped by an environment that made much of their believing in the Bible, believing in Jesus, believing in God. And in coming out of that, they experienced a lot of doubt, and they had questions that they didn't know what to do with. And so, there's a similar process, though I think it's different in some ways, that's happening these days when people talk about deconstruction, right? Like, a lot of what's going on in that sort of community seems like a reaction to certain ways of talking about belief that haven't always been as healthy or as constructive as we might like. I think there are some differences across the phenomenon, but there's a lot of similarity there too. So, it's really hard, because I'm a belief guy. I think that we should believe in Jesus. I think we should believe in the authority of the Bible. I think we should believe in all these things. But if we don't talk about those beliefs in the right sort of way, then we prime people to experience disappointment and tragedy in ways that really unsettle them and cause them to doubt, when I think maybe they shouldn't doubt otherwise.
Yeah, and let's get to the kids these days then, because I think that would be interesting. Just seeing again, because you have a front row seat here as a college professor at an honors college. What do you think are these sort of false presentations of Christianity that you think is the root of a lot of doubt, a lot of struggles that you're seeing from your students?
Yeah, it's a great question. In part because I think actually it's not clear to me that the kids are deconstructing, right? My college students, it's not apparent to me that they really are aware of what's happening. My impression is that actually the deconstructing phenomenon is people who are a couple of clicks older than high school students, right? They're people who are in their early or even late 20s who have spent a lot of time online, who have been exposed to certain types of intellectual communities that have buttressed their skepticisms about the church, and who have encountered, in many cases, real traumas and real sort of suffering at the hands of the church. And so they're programatizing, they're turning their doubt, their skepticism about the church into a type of program, right? Deconstructing as a type of project. It's not clear that my college students are doing that. By the time, a lot of our Christians who graduate high school, enter college, they still are being formed in ways that are very sympathetic with the faith that they've received. They've it's not like if students are in a public high school, they're unaware of the opposition or the reasons to reject Christianity. They're highly attuned to those reasons. And so by the time they get to college, if they've been in that sort of environment, they're still really interested in belief and in being a Christian. And that's true of homeschool students, right? Homeschool students are going to be highly attentive to the types of challenges. Is anyone not aware that it's hard to be a Christian these days? Like, this is seems like everyone's aware. And so everyone who's really in is still trying to make a go of it. And that's certainly how my college students seem to be. They're really committed. Now, what sort of faith tradition they're in, there's a lot of sort of fluctuation and movement between faith traditions. Evangelicals still going into Anglican churches, going into more Reformed contexts, et cetera. Like, a lot of that is still happening, but it's not a lot of people who are, I think, leaving the faith.
Yeah, so there's a lot there that I want to get to, but let's take a half step back and maybe do some term setting, because we're going to talk about deconstructing, and that is one of those things where in different corners of the internet it means different things. I've heard it mean in some corners like basically, hey, getting rid of all the sort of cultural trappings of Christianity that aren't helpful or particular, and keeping, and going back to the truth. And some people use it to mean they've lost their faith entirely. So when you're using it in this context, what do you mean by deconstruction? And do you feel like it's a good thing, bad thing, or just sort of a neutral thing that can go either way?
Yeah, you're right that it is used variously, and I hesitate to use the term because I feel like once I say it, people are going to discount or dislike whatever I say after that, right? Because they're going to think that's not how I'm using deconstruction. I'm using it in this very precise way. I'm like, okay. I think, however it's being used, I'm really dubious about it as a posture of the mind, right? Constructive ways of thinking are not often deconstructive, right? We think in ways where we start from a posture of belief and we try to understand the world around us. I think that that's a sort of healthy disposition to have about the world. There are things that you don't understand and you're trying to understand them. There are things that you don't know and you're trying to come to know them. If you think about deconstruction, it has built in to the idea the falseness of what's being torn down, right? Like, you've concluded that this way of seeing the world is in fact false and you're tearing it away. And that seems to me to be the sort of thing that would happen at the end of an investigative process, right? At the end of a process of questioning and thinking and reasoning. And so, like a lot of the people who are deconstructing, they've concluded that this way of seeing the world is false because they've experienced abuse or they have stories of sort of harm and suffering within the church and so on. And I understand why they would be tempted to believe that Christianity is false, right? That the version of Christianity that they grew up in is false. I also think it's reasonable to draw distinctions between ways of seeing the world and the types of harms or sufferings that result within certain types of communities. And being able to distinguish between those two things is a very difficult, very mature act that deconstructing as a process, I don't think inclines people to do, right? Because they just assume this community has these abuses. This way of seeing the world is necessarily false. We're binding those two things together. We cannot pry them apart. I think that that's a very difficult stance to have. And it's one I worry that actually sets people up for disappointment for whatever communities they go into after they deconstruct. Because I'm enough of a believer in sin as a reality that I think even the communities that people enter are likely to be affected by sin. And if you are leaving a community because of the sins that are present within it, you have to be really careful that you don't recreate those sins in whatever community you enter into.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I like your phrase, the posture of the mind, because I by inclination, and as someone who remembers what it was like to be a teenager and young adult, I can hear the siren call of the cynic, because being cynical about things is super duper fun. It's an intellectual rush to say, like, these people in power, they suck. I'm smarter than them, so I'll show them why their system doesn't work, which is very fun. It makes you feel really good about yourself. But there is a danger there. First of all, because you're assuming going in, these people are wrong and I'm right. Second of all, it's very hard to build anything positive from there. It's much easier to tear something down than build something up. So before we get into maybe healthier postures of the mind to look at with proper questioning, are there any other common pitfalls that you've observed for folks who sort of start this process out wrong, besides the pitfall of the sort of deconstruction siren song?
Yeah, no, I would just say I think you're exactly right about the sense of superiority, the kind of intellectual rush that it is to have this sort of cynicism. I quote Kierkegaard actually has a line where he complains that those who think about or the ancient Greeks thought that doubt was a task for a whole lifetime, but everyone in our age begins with it, right? And there's a sense in which for Kierkegaard, the sort of Socratic doubt, the sort of Socratic type of questioning is something that you have to earn. It's not something that's given. And it is not meant to be a kind of cynical rejection of everything that you've received. It's meant to be a posture, a studied posture that is in one respect prophetic, but is prophetic for the sake of coming to understand and coming to help your neighbor understand what's good and what's true and what's beautiful. And that's what that posture is meant to inculcate. And I do think, like, if you start from deconstruction, I mean, you guys do a lot of art stuff, right? And my question is, what about the posture of the mind that is deconstructing is likely to generate beautiful things?
Yeah.
And that's a hard question to answer.
No, it really is. And you've touched on one of my soapboxes, so I apologize to listeners in advance, but you know this too, where there's this human tendency where if there's a belief system that you used to be sort of entranced by and you since rejected it, you view very harshly. That's me with a lot of postmodernism. There was a phase when I was very enamored with Derrida. I thought he was super cool and super clever. I no longer do. So because of that, now the whole system is like, nails on a chalkboard, get your deconstructing out of here. But that does have effects in a lot of different ways. Like you look at it a lot with, things like modern art, where it's so parasitic, right? Where I feel like a lot of modern art sort of peaked with, what was the name of the guy who put the with the urinal in the museum? Is like, that's it. That's it, Duchamp. I feel like a lot of art over the past several decades, century or more, is basically trying to one up that idea. But it's sort of the same as like you're taking down the systems, you're putting the museum as an institution on trial. There's something there, but you don't want to linger there. And if you just linger there, you keep rehashing the same stale argument. So yes, part of me wants to go on a whole bit. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Stop.
No, I think it's always a good thing to quote Oliver O'Donovan and end with an Oliver O'Donovan quote. But there's a line that he has. He's a theologian, and he says something like that: the prophet does not have the luxury of perpetual subversion. And I think it's a wonderful critique of a kind of deconstructive mode, right? If you have to do it, then you cannot indulge in the luxury of perpetual subversion. You have to reach a point where you do something constructively, but that's really hard. And that's actually a caution for me about deconstruction as a project, right? We're creatures who are made to love and to question and to grow in understanding. And deconstruction can only be one brief moment in that process.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that too. It's not never do it. It's like, yeah, this is good for a time as part of a larger journey, right? Because it's so fun to stick to the parts of the journey that are the most fun. I talked about earlier about how fun it is to be a cynic. It's also fun to play the role of the prophet, right? To, get up and talk about how, all of you, modern Christianity is corrupt. I'm the only one who knows what God's really doing. That's super fun. I get it, but it's also dangerous to stay there. So now let's go to sort of the positive version of that. So we talked about some of the pitfalls. What is a healthier mental posture to have as you find yourself going through a period of questions and doubts?
Yeah, I think that I really make a lot of Mary's question to the angel as a paradigmatic moment for the intellectual life. In Luke, when the angel comes to Mary and says, "You're going to bear the Messiah," Luke writes that Mary is perplexed by this. I think perplexed is the right translation there. And I kind of read her as engaging in a lot of questions with the angel, going sort of back and forth and doing a little bit of philosophy with the angel. And there's a strand of early Christian writing about Mary within the Syriac tradition that frames Mary as the exemplary theologian in light of this moment. And Mary's question there, I think, is just an astonishingly beautiful question. How will these things be? Right? There's not a hint of doubt in what the angel says. She expects that what the angel has announced will come to pass, but she wants to know how. And she wants to know how because how it's going to come about matters to her, right? Like she has some personal stake. If she's told that she's going to bear the Messiah, she needs to know how is that going to be because she has not known a man, right? And that question, I think, is really exemplary. It also results in her practical decision, right? She understands, she comes to an understanding. Here's how it's going to be. And then she resolves it all. She makes a practical decision to go forward, to act. May it be to me according to thy word, she says, right? And I think that if we think about questions and questioning as a part of the Christian life, it's hard to do better than that particular moment. How will these things be? How are these things around me? How do they work? What's going on? And then resolving that process of questioning in a practical decision where we act, we do something. And then as we look back on what we've done, we open up new questions. What have I done? Let me understand what I've done. Let me try to see into what has gone on. I think that it's a really healthy mode of life, it seems to me, and a mode of life that applies to all different types of realms, whether it's art or formal schooling or just being a business person, right? Understanding how is this thing working? What's happening here? And like it's just a really clean, healthy disposition to have.
I love that. I love that example, especially my pastor pointed this out a little bit ago, where he was comparing Mary to Zechariah, right? They're very close in the gospel stories. They have, on the surface level, very similar reactions, right? Because Zechariah's doing his work in the temple. The angel tells him that his wife's going to have this son, and he gives her like, how can this be? But it's a different how can this be, right? Because, Zechariah, he's a sophisticated guy, he's an important religious figure, he's in the prime of his life, and he seems to ask it from this sophisticated doubt, like, how can that be? Whereas Mary, like you said, comes at it from a place of faith and in wonder. It's very interesting to see those two things played against each other right from the start of the Gospels, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's really important to underscore that the verbs are different between them, right? That Mary's is a future tense. How will this be, right? Whereas Zechariah's question is a verb that has to do with knowledge. How can I know this, right? And like that question, how can I know this to be true? A lot of translations will give it something like, how can I be sure that this is true. The angel has come to Zechariah in the same way that the angel comes to Mary. Zechariah is the high priest, right? Like he's in the temple. He should know actually that when the angel comes and says this, that it is going to happen. And he should not doubt what the angel tells him and ask for more surety about the angel's word. He, of all people, should know the story of the Messiah to such a degree that he anticipates that this could happen in any lifetime, but including his own. And yet his question, how can I be sure of this? It's actually a very modern question in one respect. He really wants a kind of certainty. He really wants surety in a way that Mary actually just accepts that she has surety, and she really wants to understand what's given to her. And so I think they are very different questions in ways that really do highlight two different paths for thinking. And we should be more like Mary than Zechariah for sure.
And something related to that, which you've brought up, is the sort of connection between faith, asking questions, especially in the context of children. And you talk about how children's question asking is a good example for us when we're doing our own questioning. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, I mean, any parent who's had a 4-year-old knows they can be very tedious, right? They can keep asking why until the parents are exhausted. Usually, the parents are exhausted much sooner than the children are exhausted when it comes to questioning, and we love that about kids. We think it's one of the best features of children, that they are so fascinated by the most mundane realities around them. And they're just little sponges who keep asking these questions and want to soak up everything about the world. And I think actually that's a very healthy disposition to have. And when Christ says, you must become like the little children in order to enter the kingdom, I think that's one of the things that he has in mind, that he wants us to be sponges, to ask in these sorts of ways. Now, it is also a feature of children that they sometimes ask questions at the wrong times, and that they don't recognize that there are practical realities that they have to engage in that limit what questions can be answered, that parents actually cannot answer every single question a child has, because parents have a limited amount of time and the child has a limited amount of time, and the child has to act. They have to go to bed. They really do have to get some sleep, or tomorrow is going to be miserable, right? And so I think there is a kind of maturation that recognizes there are limits on our questions, and we need to put limits on our questionings in these sorts of ways. But the kind of spirit of the child who's asking these questions, I think, is something that we really do lose through our formal educational process, a lot of us, and that we need to rediscover and tap into within our Christian lives. George MacDonald, I think, somewhere says that there's a childhood that we must grow into as we get old. And I think that it's a beautiful image. And I think actually learning to love questions and questioning is partially what that childhood is about.
Another quotation I think about a lot here is that famous G.K. Chesterton one, where we have sinned and grown old and our Father is younger than we.
Yeah. And the child says, exactly. Do it again. And we get tired of it, right? The child does that with questioning, and we're just like, enough, please.
Something else that really strikes me, because I have young children as well, so I experience this all the time, where my kids will just get hooked on a subject and they just want to ask everything about it, where a big part of it is those questions seem to come from a real space of security, right? Like the kid feels very comfortable around their parents. They feel comfortable asking these questions. They don't feel like there's anything unsafe about it. And I do think that's something we all need to keep in mind too. It's kind of a silly example, but I gave it on a recent podcast. We were talking about aliens in fiction, where for a lot of times when I was a kid, I had this unquestioned assumption that if space aliens were real, the Bible was made up and false. So I was very scared to research it. I was like, what am I doing here? But then later on, I was like, okay, well, maybe this is actually a good thing to have questions about. So what would you say to this whole issue of feeling like you have the safety to ask questions in an environment where you're secure?
I think it's a great point, and I think it's true about children. Louis Giussani, who's a Catholic theorist, at one point makes a similar point in terms of those who are most secure, those who have the strongest sense of what they believe about the world, will be most free to ask questions. And I think, like in questioning, we go on a journey. We go voyage out into this unknown region and we explore. And that's a really threatening thing to do. There are dangers within the unknown. But if we know whence we came and we know that we are well equipped for that sort of journey because the people around us have shaped us to do it in such a way that we're safe and we know what we're doing, then we'll do it cheerfully and happily and with freedom. And I think that questioning, one of the things I really want the church to recover is a strong sense of catechesis, right? A strong sense of the formation of Christians in what we believe, because the thicker our formation is as Christians, the more comfortable we're going to be meeting questions as questions rather than as threats or as doubts or as disturbances to us, right? Because we'll know, the more robust formation we have, we'll know what the stakes are for the questions that we get, and we'll know how plausible certain answers are and how implausible certain answers are, right? And so the more we know, the more we understand, actually the safer questions become. It's a bit paradoxical, right? But I think it's a really important point that you bring up.
And to that point, something that I saw you bring up in an interview that I thought was fascinating. Because when you're doing the questioning, there's also, coming from this sense of security, you can ask questions from in a lot of different areas. Because you have this story, or that you hinted at, that you really became convinced of the truth of Christianity through reading Plato. Tell us how that happened.
Yeah, we did these weird, it was a weird undergrad program. And we did these weird weekend retreats, essentially, where we spent 30 hours of the course of a weekend talking together about a Platonic dialogue. And the year that I did it, it was Plato's Symposium. And, the symposium brings up all sorts of questions. How do you reconcile the body and soul, right? What do you do with the one and the many? And it just, I think Plato asks questions better than anyone in history. And immersing myself in those questions made me realize, I think, the limits of Plato's way of looking at the world, and made Christianity seem intensely satisfying, because it just felt like Christianity had answers to those questions, but answers that were themselves so tricky, like so interesting, that they raised so many more questions, right? Like this is the one thing that I have always wanted about Christianity. It's not that you just have answers to the world's hardest questions. It's that those answers themselves are question generating answers. And I think that that's a part of why it's so satisfying, because it's a resolution that hurdles you forward into the next level of thinking. And I don't think if it did that, we would find it quite as satisfying as we do. But in order to find it that satisfying, I think you really have to understand at a very deep level, what are the questions to which Christianity is the answer? Like, how do you resolve death as a problem? And do you think that the sort of transhumanists, the people who want to upload our brains to the cloud, do we think that that's a really compelling resolution to the problem of death, that really encompasses everything? I think, well, no, but the resurrection is also a weird answer that you've got to spend a lot of time trying to unpack to understand how that works, right? So I think, like there's a really satisfying dimension to Christianity. I really do believe it's true all the way down. But partially, weirdly, only because it raises a lot of questions for me.
Yeah, and to that point, and we're running low on time, so sort of final question here. We've been talking a lot about, speaking with young people who we may anticipate are about to go through a period of questioning and doubts, or speaking to folks a little bit further along in the midst of it. But let's go past that. If somebody goes through a period of questioning and doubts well and faithfully, what do you think the fruit is for them on the other side?
I know silences on podcasts are not permitted. It's like the breaking all the podcast rules. But that's one that I want to sit in silence about for a while. So I'm just filibustering now. I do think that there is a sense of peace that Augustine talks much about as the resolution of our desires, the tumults of this world. We're tossed upon the seas of this world. We're thrown this way and that way by every wind and wave that's about us. And in contrast to that, the kingdom of God is a place of peace, of the tranquility of order. But the peace that Augustine describes is not stasis, but motion. T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, I think, nails this sense of peace, right? We must be still and still moving, to use his line, right? Like the still point at the center of the turning world, this sense of the resolution of our desires, but resolution and this peace being an intensity of life that constitutes real movement. I think that's what I hope people would come to out of a sense of the being thrown about on the seas of doubt, that they would feel peace, but a peace that has an intense, burning love that just moves them to continue to seek to understand the deposit of the faith that they have been given and what they affirm. That's what I hope people come to.
I think that's a great point to end on as well. So once again, the book is called Into Questions, Cultivating the Love of Learning Within the Life of Faith. The author is Matthew Lee Anderson. And where can we find you? Where can we find the book?
Well, if you're a masochist and are still on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it, I'm at Matt Lee Anderson. You can find the book everywhere, I hope. You can send me an email through MatthewLeeAnderson.com. It's my website. I've got a newsletter, MatthewLeeAnderson.com. Everything can be found there. Very narcissistically named website that is just my name.
Well, there we go. Well, thank you again so much. Really appreciate you joining us here for this time. And listeners, as y'all can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a little bit of spare time right now, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.